There's a moment everyone reaches. You realize all your controlling and forcing never gave you what you wanted. You tried to force a relationship. It went its own way anyway. You tried to force your career. You ended up somewhere else. And underneath all that gripping, an exhaustion that never lifts. Carl Jung spent his career studying this moment, and what he found was simple. The people who healed most weren't the ones who gained more control. They were the ones who let go and trusted something larger. Stay until the end. The final lesson is the one Jung called the most important thing he ever discovered. 1. The ego was never built to run the whole show. Let's start with what Jung actually meant by the structures inside you, because almost everyone misunderstands this. The ego, in Jung's framework, is not your enemy. It is the part of you that organizes daily life, that makes decisions, sets goals, manages relationships, gets the necessary things done. It is essential. Without it, you could not function. But Jung discovered something the ego itself cannot see from the inside. The ego is small. Not small in importance, small in scope. It is one part of a much larger psychic system, and it was never designed to govern the entirety of who you are. The ego knows what it wants. It does not know what it needs. The ego can plan a future based on what it currently understands. It cannot account for what it does not yet know about itself. The ego believes, almost by necessity, that its current perspective is the complete picture. And this is where the exhaustion begins. Because when the ego tries to control everything, every outcome, every relationship, every result, it is attempting a task far beyond its actual capacity. It is trying to run a system it was never built to run alone. Jung observed that this attempt, the ego's overreach, is the source of an enormous amount of human suffering. Not suffering caused by life's actual difficulties, suffering caused by the exhausting, ultimately futile effort to control what was never controllable in the first place. 2. Beneath the ego, something larger is already at work. Here is where Jung's discovery becomes genuinely radical. He did not believe that beneath the ego there was simply chaos, or randomness, or an absence of order waiting to be imposed by conscious effort. He believed that beneath the ego, in the vast region of the psyche he called the unconscious, there exists an intelligence, not a separate being, not a voice that speaks in words, a patterning intelligence, organizing experience according to a logic the conscious mind cannot fully access. Jung called the deepest organizing center of this system the self. Not the small self of daily identity, the larger self, capitalized, that represents the totality of who you actually are, including everything the ego has not yet integrated, accepted, or even discovered. This self, Jung believed, has its own direction, its own sense of where your life is actually trying to go, which is not always where your ego has decided it should go. And this is the structure underneath every spiritual tradition that has ever spoken about surrendering to something greater than the self. When religious language speaks of trusting God, of surrendering your will, of letting go, and allowing a larger plan to unfold, Jung believed it was pointing, however imperfectly, at something psychologically real. The experience of releasing the ego's grip and allowing the deeper organizing intelligence of the self to guide the process instead. Not metaphorically, not as comforting fiction, as an actual, observable shift in how a person's life unfolds once they stop fighting the current and start working with it. 3. Why letting go feels like dying? Because, in a sense, it is. This is the part that explains why surrender is so terrifying for most people. It is not simply difficult. It is experienced, at a deep psychological level, as a kind of death. Because the ego, the part of you that has been managing, controlling, deciding, has built an entire identity around being the one in charge. If you are not the one controlling the outcome, who are you? If your plans are not the thing determining your life, what is determining it? If you stop gripping, what happens to you? Jung called this experience ego death, and he did not use the phrase lightly. The ego experiences the loosening of its control as an existential threat, not because anything is actually being destroyed, but because the identity built around control genuinely cannot survive the letting go in its current form. This is why people resist surrender so fiercely, even when their gripping has clearly stopped working, even when the controlling has produced exhaustion, anxiety, broken relationships, and a life that feels smaller than it should. The ego would rather continue suffering in a familiar way than risk an unfamiliar transformation it cannot predict or control. Jung's insight here is crucial. The fear of letting go is not irrational. It is the accurate perception that something is genuinely about to change. The question is whether that change is something to survive or something to allow. 4. The unconscious has been trying to communicate the whole time. Jung made an observation in his clinical work that changed how an entire generation of psychologists understood the human mind. The unconscious is not silent. It is constantly speaking, through dreams, through symptoms, through synchronicities, through the recurring patterns and feelings that the conscious ego tends to dismiss, override, or explain away. The exhaustion you feel from constant controlling, that is a message. The recurring dream that won't stop appearing, that is a message. The sense of being pulled towards something you cannot fully justify with logic, that is a message. The crisis that finally forces you to stop and reconsider everything, that too is a message. Often the loudest one, because the quieter ones were ignored. Jung believed the unconscious, and ultimately the self, uses every available channel to communicate with the conscious mind. Because the conscious mind, left to its own devices, will often steer the whole system somewhere it should not go. This is why he placed such enormous importance on dreams, not as random neural noise, as genuine communication from a part of the psyche that sees more than the ego can see. The person who has learned to listen to this communication, rather than dismiss it as irrational, inconvenient, or beneath consideration, gains access to information the conscious mind alone could never produce. And this listening is, in Jung's framework, one of the most concrete practices of letting go and trusting something larger than the ego's plan. Not blind faith, attentive faith, the willingness to take seriously what the deeper psyche is communicating, even when it contradicts what the ego had already decided. 5. Synchronicity, when letting go aligns you with something larger. This is one of Jung's most controversial and most misunderstood ideas. He noticed, repeatedly, in his own life and in the lives of his patients, a phenomenon that defied conventional causality. Meaningful coincidences. Events that were not causally connected in any way science could explain, and yet carried a significance that felt undeniable. Thinking of someone moments before they call. Encountering, repeatedly, the exact symbol or idea you needed, at precisely the moment you needed it. A chance meeting that changes the direction of your entire life. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidence without causal connection. He did not claim to fully explain it. He was a scientist, and he held the phenomenon with appropriate uncertainty. But he noticed something important about when synchronicity tends to occur. It happens far more often during periods when a person has genuinely let go of rigid ego control. When the gripping relaxes, when the forcing stops, when a person moves through life with openness rather than the white-knuckled effort to make a specific outcome happen. It is as if, Jung suggested, the deeper order of the psyche, the self, can only fully express itself through the world once the ego stops drowning out its signal with constant control. This is, perhaps, the closest Jung came to a psychological explanation for the religious experience of feeling guided. The sense that things are lining up, that you are being led, that something larger than your own planning is participating in the unfolding of your life. Whether this is mystical or simply a shift in perception, Jung found it to be one of the most reliably reported experiences of those who had genuinely learned to surrender. 6. Individuation, the lifelong process letting go makes possible. Jung's central concept, the one toward which his entire body of work was oriented, was individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, as opposed to who your ego, your conditioning, your culture, and your fears decided you should be. This is not a quick process. Jung considered it the work of an entire lifetime. And here is the crucial connection to letting go. Individuation cannot happen while the ego maintains total control, because the ego, by its nature, can only work with what it already knows. It can optimize, refine, and pursue the goals it has already conceived. It cannot discover what it does not yet know exists. The parts of you that have been rejected, hidden, never developed, what Jung called the shadow, and the deeper potentials that have never been expressed, these can only emerge through a process the ego does not fully control. This is why individuation requires surrender. Not surrender of effort, surrender of the illusion that the ego's current map is the complete territory. The person who white-knuckles their way through life, refusing to let go of their existing plan even when life is clearly trying to redirect them, often spends decades circling the same limited version of themselves. The person who learns to release the grip, who trusts that something deeper than the ego's current understanding knows where this is actually going, opens the door to becoming someone they could not have planned to become. This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's psychology. You cannot think your way into who you are fully capable of becoming. You can only become it by trusting a process larger than your current thinking. 7. Why crisis is so often the doorway. This is one of Jung's most clinically grounded observations. The people who undergo the deepest transformation almost always arrive at it through crisis. Not because crisis is good. Jung never romanticized suffering, but because crisis does something the ego, left undisturbed, will almost never do voluntarily. It breaks the ego's grip. The plan that was working perfectly stops working. The control that felt so secure reveals itself to be an illusion. The identity built around managing everything successfully collapses under circumstances it cannot manage. And in that collapse, terrifying, disorienting, often genuinely painful, something becomes possible that was not possible before. The opening. Because the ego, in crisis, is finally forced to admit what it could never admit while things were going according to plan. I do not actually know what to do. And in that admission, that genuine not knowing, there is suddenly room for something else to enter. The deeper intelligence of the unconscious, the guidance of the self, the synchronicities and signals that were always present but were drowned out by the noise of confident control. This is why so many people describe their darkest periods as also being, eventually, the most transformative. Not because the pain itself was valuable, because the pain finally accomplished what years of comfortable functioning never could. It got the ego out of the way long enough for something deeper to take the lead. 8. What trust actually means in Jung's psychology. This word, trust, is used constantly and understood rarely. In Jung's framework, trust does not mean passivity. It does not mean abandoning effort, responsibility, or engagement with your life. It means something more precise. It means releasing your attachment to a specific, predetermined outcome while remaining fully engaged with the process of living. You still act, you still show up, you still do the work in front of you, but you release the white-knuckled insistence that the outcome must look exactly like what your ego planned. This is the difference between forcing and flowing, language Jung's successors would later develop, but the underlying concept is entirely his. Forcing says, "This must happen this way, on this timeline, or I have failed." Flowing says, "I will engage fully with what is in front of me, and trust that the larger pattern, the one I cannot fully see from where I stand, is unfolding correctly even when it doesn't match my plan." This is genuinely difficult, because it requires holding two things simultaneously that feel contradictory. Full engagement and full release. Caring enough to show up completely, and trusting enough to release the outcome once you have. Jung believed this combination, engaged surrender, was the actual psychological mechanism behind what religious traditions have called faith. Not blind belief in things that cannot be examined. The practiced, demonstrated trust that something larger than your current understanding is participating in your life, built through repeated experience of it proving true. 9. The shadow you must accept before you can truly let go. There is a reason many people cannot fully surrender, even when they intellectually want to. Jung's concept of the shadow explains why. The shadow is everything about yourself that you have rejected, hidden, or refused to acknowledge. Your anger, your envy, your selfishness, your capacity for cruelty. The parts of you that do not fit the image you have built of who you are supposed to be. Most people spend enormous energy keeping the shadow hidden, from others, and even from themselves. And this hidden material does not disappear simply because it is not examined. It operates underground, influencing behavior, relationships, and choices in ways the conscious ego does not understand or control. Here is the connection to letting go. You cannot fully trust a process you do not understand if you are simultaneously terrified of what that process might reveal about you. The unexamined shadow makes surrender feel dangerous because some part of you suspects, correctly, that letting go of control might expose exactly the parts of yourself you have worked hardest to hide. Jung's prescription was not comfortable. He insisted that genuine individuation and genuine trust in the deeper self requires facing the shadow directly, acknowledging the parts of yourself you have rejected, integrating them rather than pretending they do not exist. Because once the shadow has been faced, once there is nothing left that you are desperately trying to hide from yourself, the fear underneath the resistance to letting go significantly diminishes. You can finally trust the process, because you are no longer afraid of what it might show you. You have already looked,